Hello, my name is Mark Harris. Welcome to Left on Red Media. Thank you to Duncan Wheldon, who is our guest today. He is an economist and writer. He's worked in finance, he's worked in the Bank of England, and as an economics writer for Newsnight, The Economist, and others. His first book, 200 Years of Muddling Through, explored the history of Britain's economy. And now he's got a new book out, Blood and Treasure, which examines the economic consequences of war across centuries, from medieval raids to modern geopolitics. Thank you for coming, Duncan.
Thank you for having me. I always like that sort of introduction. You can sort of summarise it as Duncan struggles to hold down a job for a long period of time.
Or Duncan is so much in demand that he has to give bits of his time to lots of different people, whichever way you want to look at it. So we'll get straight into it. So your book is brilliant, Triumph, excellent, a perfect follow-up to 200 Years of Muddling Through. I mean, really, what prompted you to write it? What gap do you think it fills?
Yeah, okay. So, what I've learned over my career is writing about economic history is easier than writing about the economy. Because when stuff's already happened, you can go back and explain why. Talking about the future, very hard. So I knew I wanted to write another book about economic history. I felt there wasn't much more I wanted to say, specifically about Britain, having done a book on that. So I was looking for a sort of topic, a way into talking about lots of different ideas. And I thought that war and conflict was actually the most interesting. Because, the argument I make in the book is that the economics of war are really important to economics in general, to economic history, to how, to why things have turned out how they have. And then, when I started writing it, this was just before Russia invaded Ukraine. And then it suddenly became a lot more topical as I was working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, going through your book, reading your book, Ukraine always jumps out, right? It has been the war that we are all thinking about over the last couple of years. It's upended global economics, geopolitics, and everything else. So that is always what I was thinking about when I was reading it. I mean, you write that war has historically forced states to transform how they manage their economies. What are the signs that the war in Ukraine specifically is prompting that kind of structural economic rethink in Britain? And how do you think Britain is going to respond and needs to respond?
Yes, I mean, to start with, one of the big things of Russia invading Ukraine is just, a complete violation of international norms. And yes, Russia and Ukraine, Russia had invaded Ukraine in 2014. And, across the West, we sort of shrugged our shoulders and, put some sanctions on, but generally allowed this to stand. This is the war that's been happening since 2022 is of a different character. It's the kind of large-scale conflict in Europe of a sustained nature, which we haven't seen since 1945. And I think that's prompted everyone to take the threat of this sort of thing much more seriously. But of course, it's sort of a two-part act, isn't it? That, if you'd asked me this question a year ago, when Joe Biden was still in the White House, when it looked like there might be another Democrat in the White House afterwards, we'd be having a different conversation. What's really prompted a much bigger rethink in Britain and in Western Europe is the election of President Trump, because we now not only have an aggressive, revanchist Russia prepared to use military force to rewrite borders in Europe, but the American security guarantee is the most uncertain it's been since the 1940s. So that is prompting a big rethink of how we think about international security, how we think about our armed forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm mindful that Western politicians, European politicians, really have spoken about the need to rearm, to become more serious about defence, to become more independent with the defence posture since 22 and beyond, and before, sorry. I mean, are they going to do it this time? Do you think that this is really marks a change where they're really going to get serious, or do you think it's going to fall by the wayside? I suppose if you look at the stock price of various European armaments companies, that tells a story. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Rheinmetall's best performing stock in Europe for the last few months. Yes, I think we are seeing a significant change. So I think what's happened in Germany is huge. Germany for 15 or so years has had a very tight fiscal policy focused on bringing down debt, despite German debt being already quite low. The new government, the new government's very first act before it was even formed was to rewrite those fiscal rules, to give themselves the ability to borrow €1 trillion, of which €500 billion is pledged for German rearmament. That's, even in, in macroeconomics, we talk about a lot of big numbers. €500 billion is a really big number. So, Germany is taking this seriously. We've seen other countries who aren't the usual suspects, like Spain recently, say they're going to increase defence spending up to 2% of GDP, which is quite a big move for Spain, which has historically been a relatively low spender. Poland is taking it very, very seriously. The Baltic states are. Now in Britain, what have we got? Okay, so far we've had a lot of rhetoric, and we haven't had much in the way of concrete steps. We've had the announcement that defence spending as a share of national income is going to go from 2.3 to 2.5%. And, we can, and that's of course been funded in the first round by cutting international aid, which I don't think is actually the best way to fund that. But, we've got the big step, 2.3 to 2.5. Symbolically, that was a really big move. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that's the end of it. What it reminds me of is sort of March, April, May 2020 when the pandemic hit, when the response came in a series of steps. If you think back to the March budget in 2020, it felt massive. It felt like this is fiscal shock and all, biggest fiscal giveaway in 3 decades. And, 3 or 4 months later, it looked tiny after everything else that happened. So I think, we've made the step up to 2.5%. I think at the next NATO summit coming up in June, there may be a higher target than the current 2% NATO target. I think Britain will be a country that hits that, but I don't think 2.5% is the end.
I mean, so my next question, I guess, would be, what is the end, and what are the main challenges to achieving that? Is it political will? Are there structural challenges that we need to overcome? What are the limiting factors in your view?
So where is the end? Okay, I think the end depends on a lot of assumptions, but I think it is realistic to think across the European NATO countries, you're talking usual annual defence expenditure of something in the range of 3.5% of GDP. Let's call it 3.5%, which is roughly where it was towards the end of the Cold War. You've possibly, on top of that, you're going to need higher spending in the short term in terms of capital, because it may be that there are various American capacities and capabilities that we need to replace. So I think you're looking at sort of a long-term call it 3.5% of GDP in the long term, maybe 4.5% for a few years in the 2020s as you're buying new things. Now, that is quite a big change in defence spending. And in general, the picture for the last 3 decades has been that defence spending has been falling. And I think the first challenge is just the fiscal one, that you're looking at finding another 1.5%, 2% of national income to spend on defence for the next few years, at a time that debt interest is also quite high, at a time that there are lots of other really important public spending pressures, whether it's NHS, education, local government, social care, whatever. I think that's the first one, is how you're going to pay for it. You've got 3 options. You can borrow for it. I think borrowing for current expenditure is always a tough sell. Maybe you can borrow for the capital side, but for a lot of this, borrowing is not really going to be the answer. So either you can cut other bits of public spending, which is what the first round was, cutting international aid, or you can increase taxation. And I think that's the problem, that the problem isn't the economics of how we pay for this, it's the politics of how we make that work. Because I think, the British public are always quite happy to be bellicose about Russia. They have been for a long time. Always will be. But asking the British public, and I think in abstract, the idea of spending more on defence is something the British public are probably on board with. I don't yet know if they're on board for their taxes going up to pay for that, or other bits of public spending being cut to pay for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly at a time when the government is likely to be asking the public to put up with tax rises to pay for a whole range of other things as well.
Yes.
But aside from the fiscal position, what are the other trade-offs in remaking an economy like this, in changing an economy from what it's doing now to doing something really quite different?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, wars, right, the idea of taking defence spending from where it was at the start of this year, 2.3% up to 3.5%, 4%, essentially, getting towards 70-80% increase in defence, percentage point increase in defence spending, almost doubling defence spending, sounds very expensive. I mean, what I would say is actually, if it works i.e., if Europe can build itself a credible deterrent against further Russian attempts outside of Ukraine, then it's cheap at half the price. I mean, Russia at the moment is spending 8-9% of GDP on its war in Ukraine. You don't have to go up to sort of Second World War 40-45% of GDP to realize that your modern wars are very expensive. 8-9% of GDP in a major war. It is cheaper to spend that money now on deterring than it is to end up fighting a conventional war. Now, the challenges, I think, and this is, right, so what's going to happen? We're going to be talking about more defence manufacturing in Britain. That's going to be a big part of it. The government talks up, rightly, the opportunities there for, skilled, quite well-paying jobs. I think the problem that people aren't fully grasping or thinking through is that when you look at the pool of workers which manufacturing tends to recruit from, it is very similar to the pool of workers that construction tends to recruit from. And I think the problem we have at the moment is we want to increase house building, which we should be doing. We want to increase infrastructure spending and speed up infrastructure construction, which we should be doing. And we want to be increasing our defence industrial base, which we should be doing. Now, this all starts to get quite hard if you want to do all of these things at the same time in a way which doesn't result in sort of soaring wages and inflation. And that's going to be the tricky trade-off to manage, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense to me, at least. I mean, one challenge you highlight in the book is how slow institutional adaptation can limit effectiveness in war. Britain's current defence and economic institutions, you're talking about, the Treasury, which we talk about a whole range of different policy areas, but MOD procurement, MOD itself, how do they have to change specifically to meet these new demands of rearmament?
Yes, I think that there's a first one I think the two things have got to change. So firstly, we've got to have a very clear vision of what we want our defence capabilities and capacities to look like. And hopefully the defence review, which is ongoing, will give us that. Because, it's not just a case of, whacking spending up to 3.5%. It's what are we spending that money on? Is the priority the Navy? Is it the Army? Is it the Air Force? What is it, cyber? What do we want to look like? You've got to get that clear and right. The big change that needs to happen in defence procurement. So, speaking to a military historian of the Second World War about this quite recently, saying, the problem is, in the Second World War, if you look at Anglo-American procurement, the question that defence planners are asking industrialists is not what's the big high-spec thing with the perfect design requirements, can you make it for me? It's what can I have next week? And I think that's a huge shift. The MOD procurement over the last, Britain hasn't fought a major war since 1945 for the Falklands War, fought various smaller things, big contribution in Iraq and Afghanistan, but nothing on this, the scale of what we're now talking about. And there's been a very much a sort of peacetime procurement mindset of, sit down at the drawing board, what's the ideal bit of equipment, all of these high-end things, okay, it's going to be quite expensive, we'll have it in 10 years' time. Now, who knows what happens in Ukraine over the next few weeks, the next few months. And I think, what happens in Ukraine will have a big impact on how quickly Russia can rebuild its armed forces for potential further aggressive action. The numbers across different European defense ministries on how long Russia needs to be ready for another war vary from 3-4 years to 5, 6, 7, 8. But, we're on that sort of 5-6 year timeline. So if you're thinking in terms of, okay, Britain needs to be playing its part in a cross-European alliance, maybe with, maybe without the United States to deter Russia, you need stuff that is on the ground and ready in 5 or 6 years. And that might not be as good as the really high-end stuff we could have in 10 or 15 years' time. And that's the mindset shift that's got to happen in defence planning.
And, and actually, you referred to the length of time it might take for Russia to rearm and prepare for another go. And I saw a very interesting thread on Blue Sky, or was it Twitter, one of the two, by your colleague Shashank Joshi, which was very, very good on that. I think I saw it today. I mean, is it possible for Britain's defence procurement teams to make that change, to change what they've been doing up to now, and to make that change to do it very differently in the next 5 years? And how far off the pace are we in procurement? I mean, looking at it from my very inexpert point of view, we don't look to be very good at it at all. Are other countries much better? Is there anything we can learn from them? How do other countries do it better?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally Western militaries are not as good at procurement as they once were. The US is maybe an exception, that it's able to get stuff very quickly, but it really does pay over the odds for it. If you look at across Europe, Britain, Europe, and this is where it gets quite interesting. What are the problems with defence procurement in Germany, France, Britain? They're all quite similar. One is too often wanting really, really high spec stuff designed to requirements which are perfect world requirements, which will take a long time to get. But more than that, it's ordering in small batch sizes, which has a real problem on the economics of supplying this stuff. It's not giving certainty to the industry over the future pipeline of these orders, and it's buying in a really uncoordinated way as well. And I think, actually, in terms of Britain's relationship with the defence and security relationship with the European Union, some sort of rationalisation of, across the European allies, there is going to be X demand for combat aircraft, X demand for helicopters, X demand for drones, X demand for tanks and armoured vehicles over the coming 10 to 15 years will help drive investment in the defence industry, bring down the unit price of what we're paying for. But it's hard. It is hard. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. And we're talking today when there have been announcements around Britain's renegotiation with the EU. A big part of that is how we fit into the overall European defensive posture and the new arrangements they're putting in place. In particular, the funds that they have available for defence procurement, and whether we will our defence companies will be able to bid for those. What's your view on the debates and the discussions and the results that have happened so far, and how important is that to what we're talking about?
I think it is important to what we're talking about, and I think it was always the idea that the EU was going to establish an 150 billion euro fund of loans to help defence, to help the defence industry develop, to help countries rearm. The idea they were going to exclude Britain, I don't think was ever particularly credible. Britain has a very large and successful defence industry, and it's interesting, isn't it? We can call the defence industry again now. For a long time, they preferred aerospace sector, but they're happier talking about defence now. Britain is a very important part of that. I think the problem that some European partners have had, and it's a legitimate concern, is that a lot of Britain's defence sector is very closely tied into the American defence sector, and we are now seeing countries saying, actually, I'd rather not buy American equipment. And we should be absolutely clear about this. It's not that American equipment, or F-15 Joint Strike Fighter or whatever. It's not that American equipment has a kill switch that they can remotely turn it off and it's useless. It's that, though, the support, the maintenance, the spare parts, all of that can be turned off, and this stuff degrades very, very quickly. So if you're in a world, which again a year ago it would have sounded absolutely crazy to be talking about, but if you're in a world in which you don't think the United States is a reliable security partner, this becomes a legitimate concern. And just also on the sort of related point, if we think about what's happening with Scunthorpe and steel, again, the national security argument that Britain should retain primary steel production capacity, has been made for the last 30 years. Every time a steel mill closes, someone says, well, what about national security? And generally, I've not had a huge amount of sympathy for those arguments, but I think we are now in a world when actually you do want to maintain some domestic primary steel making capacity, and that's just one way in which the world and economic policy has changed.
It's interesting because I think from my perspective, 10 or 15 years ago, I don't think we heard that much about industrial policy really. It's definitely come into vogue once more, and I think possibly even Rachel Reeves was earlier than a lot of people talking about this kind of stuff.
Securonomics and
which I know she it came a little bit from what Biden was doing in the States, as we always look over there and see what we can copy and do well as well. But how do you think industrial policy is going to play a role in the Labour government's agenda going forwards, and how important is it? How has it changed? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think more generally, industrial policy was reborn in Britain after 2008. And when Peter Mandelson was the business minister, it was the first time we'd heard a British minister talking about industrial policy since the 1970s. I think it did, to be fair, continue under Vince Cable in the coalition years. The problem we then had was we had sort of 14 years of the industrial strategy changing every 18 to 24 months. Boris Johnson quite liked it. Theresa May didn't really. George Osborne never gave it very much money. Rishi Sunak seems to have hated the entire thing. So we didn't have it. The thing about industrial strategy is if it's going to work, it's got to be long term. It's got to unlock that corporate investment. That look, here's the sort of shape we think the economy is going to be in the next 10, 15 years. Invest. This is an opportunity for you to invest to capitalise on that. So almost mission driven. This government clearly takes industrial policy a lot more seriously in as much as it relates to defence. I think there are two components to it. One is, directly in terms of the defence industry and ensuring it's got the workers it needs. That really simple things like it's got the planning permission to expand where it wants to expand. I say simple things. That's not been simple in British politics for a long time. But sort of getting the planning regime around this right, ensuring that there's sort of linking up between skills, that the workers are available. That's all important. But the interesting one, and there's been some debate around this, is it was believed in the first half of the 20th century that generally having a large manufacturing sector, whether it was doing defence stuff or not, was important if you found yourself in a major war. And there's been a lot of pushback about that over the last sort of 30, 40 years. People saying, actually, modern manufacturing, this isn't like the 1930s. You can't just turn a Ford plant into knocking out Sherman tanks in a way you could. It's much more complicated now. Now, what has been interesting in the last few months is, the German automotive industry has had an absolutely torrid time for the last 2.5, 3 years. Big declines in production. We are now seeing some, Rheinmetall is talking about hiring ex-Continental workers, taking over plants. And it turns out actually, manufacturing is still manufacturing, and you're getting skilled manufacturing workers who used to make, car parts. You can now put them to work making tank parts still.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Ukraine chapter, just talking about short-termism, you touched on the incentives that analysts face when they're preparing for war. Is there a similar issue now? There always has been in British policy making. I think it's got a lot worse and people are talking about it a lot more. This idea that political short-termism, fear of voter backlash makes it very hard to plan for these more long-term strategic threats, even though, as you say, the next 5 years are going to be all important. What's your view on that? And is there a way that we can change that?
Yeah, I think long-term certainty for this really matters. Now, to an extent, you would hope this was cross-party. You would hope if the government set out a strategic defence review, which is, by all accounts, it's going to be, a sensible, rational document. You would hope that opposition parties can broadly sign up to that strategic defence review, to that planning framework. That would help. Now, I'm not sure you can with reform, to be honest. I think there are many problems with Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Conservative Party, but I think in terms of defence and security, I can see a world in which he can vaguely agree to a timetable. Reform, on the other hand, I think I imagine keen in the abstract on higher defence spending. Whether they can credibly commit to that, given their wider sort of tax and spending agenda, I think is quite hard. I think in an ideal world you would have some sort of cross-party support of, okay, here is a framework to get to 3.5% of GDP by 2030. Without that, people making long-term investment decisions have always got one eye on British politics, thinking, okay, so this government is saying it's going to do X, Y, Z. Will the next go? You don't, fundamentally, you don't want to spend hundreds of millions of pounds of expanding capacity and hiring workers if the orders don't come through. And that's always what holds back the defence sector.
Yes, and we've seen the effects of uncertainty from the announcements about tariffs from the US and how damaging that can be. Not knowing what the tariff is going to be like in a week, never mind 90 days, never mind 10 years. But I think you touch on a point which is correct, that we have had a remarkable degree of consensus around foreign policy over the last few years and before. I don't know if it's the case that Reform shares in that consensus. They make some positive noises sometimes, and other times they are quite reticent about criticizing what Russia does and what Putin has done in the past. And there are some links between the businessmen on either side. How important is it to try and reconstruct the consensus? Is it possible? Is that something that we should try to do, or is it just up in the air?
I think the broad consensus in British politics from the 1940s until quite recently, so the Atlantic Alliance was at the core of British security, that Britain's nuclear, not everyone in every party will have agreed with this at all times, but in general, the Atlantic Alliance was a core part of Britain's security, that Britain's most important economic relationship was with the European Union, which was a close ally as well, that, defence spending should be at the higher end of what European NATO countries were spending, that the independent nuclear deterrent was something worth preserving. There was a broad consensus on all of these things. And I think what makes it harder now is that two-pronged thing. It's the fact that there is a real incredible threat on the horizon from Russia, and we don't know about the European security guarantee. And what's really complicated, I think, as well, is after Brexit, well, obviously there all sorts of confusion in terms of our relationship with Europe, but there's a lot of people who got very sort of invested in the idea of Britain and getting involved in this Indo-Pacific tilt. And I think it helped these arguments of now free of the shackles of Europe, this global Britain was going to be involving itself in Indo-Pacific affairs, etc. I mean, I think in a world when Russia has invaded Ukraine, in a world in which it's not inconceivable that Russia might chance its arm in the Baltic states or Poland, the idea that the Indo-Pacific region is a priority for Britain is hard to sustain, but I think some people are going to find it hard to give up on that.
Absolutely, and I'm minded that Britain is currently developing a very expensive new fighter jet with Japan, which is kind of designed to take on the threats in that theatre.
Yes,
and maybe that's something which is going to be spoken about a lot more. Just to move on to something slightly different, although obviously connected. The book suggests that when done right, military pressure can drive this kind of technological change, this technological innovation. The Labour government is obviously desperate for growth wherever they can find it. And I think they are also open to try new things because a lot of things haven't worked in the past. But how does the Labour government lean into defence and indeed an overall national resilience to take advantage of that kind of economic opportunity? What can they do?
Yeah, I mean, war has been a driver of economic change for a long time. It's for a long time, until really the end of the 19th century, war and preparing for war was what states did. Everything else was tiny. 20th century, obviously things are different. War has become a much smaller part of what states do. But yes, the pressures, sustained defence spending tends to be associated with innovation. That is all potentially helpful. I think in the end, though, the most likely way that defence spending can help boost British growth is that spending on defence may be a more politically popular way of spending a bit more government money, of juicing up growth a little bit. I think the idea of borrowing for defence capital spending is going to be a much easier sell with a lot of people than borrowing for other things. So it may simply be that spending on defence is just a bit politically easier than some other types of spending.
Yeah, absolutely. You write about also how corrupt patronage-based systems can still deliver results. We're not quite in that situation in the UK, but is there some sort of parallel with how the British state, as you wrote in your previous book, muddles through? Not perfect, not always fair, but it can sometimes be effective. Or are we past that point? Do we need much more fundamental reform of the whole system?
Yeah, I mean, my default view is that, so my view is that the default mode of the British state is to muddle through when it comes to the economy, to try and avoid trade-offs if it can, to sort of keep its fingers crossed and hope that something will come up. Except in a major crisis, it can move very quickly and very effectively. I think, we shouldn't forget, you don't have to go that far back in history. In the last 15 years, when the 2008 financial crisis hit, the British state and the Treasury stepped up incredibly quickly. The idea of taking equity stakes in banks was very controversial. We led the way. America eventually copied us. Very quick action. When the pandemic hit, we spoke before of, sort of step by step the response. But when the response came in that April, the furlough scheme was drawn up in the space of a few days, went into action, was the single largest bit of government expenditure on a monthly basis afterwards, and was just, a phenomenally important intervention which stopped our economy from collapsing. When there is a real crisis, the British state doesn't muddle through. It moves very, very quickly, including the Treasury. The problem is we often have to get ourselves into a real mess before we get those steps. I'm absolutely convinced if, Russia was to invade another country, in the NATO, an actual NATO member tomorrow, we would be ripping up the fiscal rules. We'd be spending huge amounts of money. We'd be buying stuff off the shelf. We'd be ramping up production. We would be responding aggressively and quickly. But you don't sort of want to be in that situation. You want to be in a situation which you can gradually increase defence over the coming 5 years as a deterrent. That is always the kind of thing that we have struggled with. Come an emergency, I have no doubt the Treasury and the government as a whole will move quickly. I'd rather we didn't get to an emergency.
Yes, so expensive no matter what you do, but cheaper if you do it earlier. Absolutely. Our final question. I'm always big on exploring, identifying, and understanding trade-offs, not ignoring them. What are the trade-offs to all of this? What do we need to be considering?
I mean, look, the first trade-off is, there's always lots of talk of the potential upside from defence spending, because there are potential upsides, but we should bear in mind firstly the opportunity cost, right? If we are going to be increasing defence spending and we want our defence industries to grow, Britain is a country pretty much at full employment, pretty much. Those workers are going to come from somewhere. The government's made very clear it wants net migration to fall. So those are going to be workers redeployed from somewhere else in our economy to doing that. And at the same time, the government wants workers to redeploy from our economy into construction. So, the first trade-off is, doing more defence is probably, on some level, going to mean doing less of something else. Secondly, spending more on defence is money that we are not spending on other public services. And I am a firm believer that we have to do this. And I think it's important that we do this as a country and as a continent with our European allies. And I think there are some potential economic upsides to this. But I don't think this should be sold as sort of an economic story. We're spending more on defence because we have to spend more on defence, and there will be economic consequences of that, some of which will be positive, some of which will be negative. I think it is always important to be upfront about the trade-offs, and I think our politics sometimes makes it hard to be upfront about trade-offs. I think it's perfect. I don't think we can say we're spending 3.5% on defence and we really want to. Because in an ideal world, we would still be in the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, when there wasn't a serious defence threat and we could spend less. So there are some potential upsides, but there are real costs, and I think it's worth being explicit about those costs.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I won't take up any more of your time. So just for the audience, Blood and Treasure, new book. It's brilliant. It is out on the 5th of June.
5th of June. You can pre-order it now. And the economist in me would say that pre-orders are very helpful because they're a useful signal to retailers they should stock it.
There you go. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant book. Everyone will enjoy it and treasure it. But yeah, thank you very much. Please remember to like, subscribe, and we will see you next time.